My name is Amina Diallo. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in Dakar, Senegal. I've worked as a professional caregiver for nearly 15 years, specializing in children with special needs. I've never been ashamed of my work. I consider it sacred. When you care for a child who struggles to connect with the world, you become their bridge, their anchor, sometimes their only comfort. So when a high-ranking executive from Abu Dhabi offered me a private position to care for his nonverbal autistic daughter, I accepted it with full heart. I packed my bags, left behind my small but warm apartment, and flew into a new life I thought would be built on trust and dignity. The girl, Lena, was beautiful. She had the kind of quiet sadness in her eyes that reminded me of my youngest brother, Mimadou, who passed away with similar struggles. Her father, Mr. Karim Al-Masri, was all politeness at first. He said the right words, paid generously, smiled for appearances, but his eyes were cold, too cold for a man with a child so delicate. Still, I focused on Lena. I learned her rhythms, her silences. I calmed her with music. For the first time in months they said she slept through the night. I was proud of the connection we were building. But beneath the glass windows and marble floors of that house, something didn't feel right. There was tension in the air, like the walls were listening. Lena would sometimes flinch at night, when she heard her father's footsteps down the hall. I watched closely. I didn't ask questions. I stayed professional. But my instincts, those instincts every woman learns to trust when she lives by caution, started to whisper that not everything in that home was as it seemed. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I found something behind a vent in the laundry room, a small black device with a blinking red light, a camera. I froze. Then I noticed another tucked into the bookshelf in Lena's room, and a third in the hallway near my quarters. These weren't for security. They were pointed in private spaces, monitored, hidden. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I just took a deep breath and kept folding. That night, I looked straight at one of the cameras, smiled softly, and whispered, "You're watching the wrong person." Then I turned off the light and sat down to pray. If they wanted to watch, I would let them watch, but I would give them something to see. I didn't run. I didn't complain. I stayed still and started planning. Because you see, when people try to hide their shame behind wealth, they forget something. Not all help comes desperate, and not every woman walks into silence unarmed. In the days that followed, I moved like nothing had changed. I still braided Lena's hair every morning, still sang to her during bath time, still smiled at Mr. Al-Masri, and thanked the cook after meals. But my mind was sharp now, alert. I paid attention to where the maids avoided. I timed the footsteps in the hallway. I noticed how the cameras shifted angles every 3 days. I began to map out the house, not just physically, but spiritually, where fear lived, where lies settled like dust, and most importantly, where the silence spoke loudest. Lena started opening up to me more, not in words but in gestures. She began to touch my hand when I hummed certain tunes. She would lay her head on my lap after long episodes of restlessness. She even drew pictures, abstract, emotional, but always with a small dark figure off to the side, a figure with red lines in the corner. I knew what she was trying to say. I knew it without needing words. She was trying to show me what she couldn't say out loud, and I promised her silently that I would not let her cries go unheard. Every night I began to document everything in a private journal I kept hidden in the lining of my luggage: dates, times, reactions, the placement of cameras, the shifts in staff, even conversations overheard, casual mentions of business partners, and private meetings. I didn't need to understand the full picture yet. I just needed a record, a quiet truth building in the shadows, because I knew eventually someone would try to make me the problem. And I was right. 2 weeks later the tone changed. Mr. Al-Masri began asking probing questions about my phone use. He told me I was too attached to Lena. One evening, his assistant informed me that I would need to take a week's unpaid leave for staff rotation and security adjustments. I smiled and nodded. I said I understood, but deep inside I knew they were preparing to push me out quietly, cleanly, before I saw too much. I stayed awake that night, thinking of every woman I knew back home who had come back from domestic work abroad with bruises, unpaid wages, or broken spirits. Stories whispered in salons, told in kitchens, stories no one believed because, on paper, they were lucky to have been hired at all. I swore I wouldn't be one of them. I wouldn't go back with silence in my suitcase. So I called an old friend, Mariam, who now worked for a child welfare NGO in the Emirates. I didn't say much over the phone, just told her I had questions about child safety protocols in private households, and whether recording devices in children's rooms were legal. Her voice grew firm. She asked if I was safe. I told her, not yet, but I will be. Miriam didn't waste time. Within 24 hours, she had sent me documents, quietly, discreetly, about federal privacy laws, especially concerning minors. It turns out that filming a child in private quarters, even under the guise of protection, crossed legal boundaries, especially if the footage was not disclosed to the guardian or the caregiver. The documents weren't just dry law, they were firewood. Now all I needed was a flame. I printed the key pages at a small shop 2 blocks away during my assigned leave. The clerk didn't even ask questions. I tucked the envelope under the floorboards of my temporary flat, just beneath the bed. The week away gave me time to breathe. I stayed low, didn't post anything online, didn't even call my family. I prayed, I rested, I read through every law 3 times. I started to think like him. Cold, calculated, cautious. If he thought he was the only one in that house capable of watching and waiting, he was wrong. I knew what he feared: exposure, reputation, shame. A man like him could afford lawyers, but not scandal, not a whisper of impropriety involving his daughter. I returned exactly on the 7th day, just as they had instructed, with a calm smile, and a suitcase packed slightly different than before. I'd hidden a voice recorder in the side pocket. I didn't plan to confront him. No, that wasn't my way. I simply wanted truth and proof. The following evenings I began recording anything that felt off. His late-night scolding of Lena, the way he snapped at the staff behind closed doors, the muttered insults when he thought no one was listening. It was subtle, but ugly. I kept the recorder running when I left the room, capturing moments that painted a quiet portrait of a man deeply unfit to raise a child who needed gentleness more than gold. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One night, Lena ran to my room, shaking, barefoot, eyes wide, no words, just trembling silence. I wrapped her in a blanket and held her for nearly an hour. When I finally coaxed her back to bed, I noticed the faintest red mark along her wrist. Not a bruise, but a pressure imprint. I didn't need a camera to tell me what had happened. I knew, and in that moment, I stopped being afraid. This wasn't just my story anymore, it was hers too. I reached out to Miriam again, and told her everything. She advised me to stay put and keep collecting. She said the agency was watching the case now. She would make sure the right people were paying attention. What I had was enough to rattle cages, but not enough to burn them down. Not yet. So I waited. I let Mr. El-Masri believe he was winning, that I was obedient, naive, and unaware. But every quiet smile I gave him now came with a silent promise behind it. I will not leave without justice, not for me, and not for her. The shift came quietly, almost too quietly. Mr. El-Masri began pacing more during the day, spending longer hours in his study. His once calculated silence was replaced by nervous questions. Have you seen my charger? Did someone enter the office? Has Lena mentioned anything strange to you? I answered, everything with the same calm expression I always wore, as if I didn't notice the way his voice cracked around the edges. He had no idea how deeply the foundation of his control had begun to erode. And the best part, I hadn't said a word, not one. The recordings were growing more damning by the day. Verbal outbursts, moments of neglect, one chilling incident where he muttered to himself in frustration after yelling at the staff, "I should have hired someone with no spine." I made sure that clip was backed up twice, once on a private cloud and once on a USB drive hidden in a bottle of conditioner in my suitcase. I had started collecting evidence not just for authorities but for Lena's future. One day she would need to know someone saw her, believed her, and protected her without raising a single fist or voice. But something else started happening too. The staff, the ones who had always kept their heads down, began to shift around me. A cleaner lingered longer in the hallway when I passed. A cook left a note folded into my apron pocket that read, "She's safest when she's with you." I wasn't alone. They had been watching too. Maybe they didn't have the resources or the courage to act before, but now they saw in me what they'd been waiting for, a quiet warrior with a plan. The silence that once protected him was beginning to speak. Then came the misstep I had been waiting for. Mr. El-Masri hosted a gathering of investors in the home. Wine, music, tailored suits, and fake laughter. It was a lavish distraction designed to polish his image, but I noticed something small. A tablet left open on his desk. During the commotion, I passed by under the pretense of bringing water and caught a glimpse of a video feed from Lena's room. Real time, My blood ran cold. He was still watching, still violating. I copied the IP address and device details and passed them to Miriam immediately. She confirmed what we feared. He had been recording from private quarters and storing footage on an unregistered server. That was the last piece we needed, the last nail in the polished coffin of his reputation. All that remained now was timing, and I knew exactly when to strike. Because a man who prides himself on control never notices when it slips through his fingers. It happened on a Tuesday, nothing dramatic, no shouting, no grand confrontation, just a quiet sequence of events that started with a knock at the door. Two officials, one in plain clothes, the other with a badge from the Department of Family Welfare, arrived early in the morning, calm, professional. They said they were following up on an anonymous report recording child welfare violations. Mr. Al-Masri greeted them with his usual arrogance, assuming his wealth would turn their inspection into nothing more than a formality. But this time his name didn't open doors, it opened files. I stayed in Lena's room, pretending to organize toys while holding her hand gently. She didn't know what was happening, not fully, but she could feel it. Her small fingers clung to mine with a quiet urgency that broke my heart. Down the hall, I could hear the tone in his voice shift from confident to clipped, from clipped to cornered. They asked about the surveillance system, the recordings, the devices in private quarters. He stuttered through half answers, until they asked if he would consent to a review of his digital equipment. That was the moment his mask cracked. His silence said more than denial ever could. I had no part in the confrontation. I didn't even appear in the room. I had already handed over everything: recordings, timestamps, IP logs, Miriam's official statements, and the handwritten testimony from two staff members who finally found the courage to speak. It wasn't my voice that took him down, it was his own, his recordings, his arrogance, his blindness to the fact that the quietest people often hold the sharpest truths. Later that afternoon, one of the officials knocked on my door. She looked tired, but kind. She told me that Lena would be placed in temporary care until a full psychological evaluation was done, but she also said the reports made it clear Lena was safest in your presence. She asked if I'd be willing to remain with her, at least until the transition could be stabilized. I agreed without hesitation, not for heroism, not for revenge, but because when someone has been abandoned in plain sight, the only thing worse than their pain is letting it continue. Mr. Al-Masri didn't look at me when they walked him out. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. Everything about him, the perfect suit, the carefully styled hair, the hollow eyes, looked like a man who still didn't understand how it had all unraveled. He believed control was about intimidation, but I had shown him that real control doesn't scream, it whispers, it waits, and when it strikes, it does so with precision that leaves no room for noise. I closed the door behind them, sat on the floor beside Lena's bed, and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. No applause, no triumph, just peace. The kind of peace that comes not from victory, but from the quiet certainty that you stood your ground, without ever raising your voice. The house felt different after he left. It wasn't just quieter, it was lighter. The tension that used to live in the corners of the hallways had vanished, like smoke finally leaving a room. Lena slept better that week. Her shoulders, once stiff with anxiety, softened when she lay down at night. She began humming back to me when I sang. She even laughed once, a real unexpected burst of sound that startled both of us into tears. That sound was the first sign that she was beginning to feel safe. It was the only reward I needed. Miriam kept me updated on the case from a distance. There wouldn't be a public trial. Mr. Al-Masri's legal team had already started negotiating in private, trying to keep the matter out of the press. But what mattered more was this: he was stripped of custody, and a long-term care plan for Lena was being arranged with input from pediatric psychologists and trauma experts. My role was being formally recognized. I wasn't just the help anymore. I was her guardian in every way that mattered, emotionally, spiritually, and soon legally. One morning, I walked into the garden, and found Lena sitting in the grass, barefoot, watching ants march over a stone. She looked up at me and placed a single flower into my palm. "Mama," she whispered, just that, one word, the first word I had ever heard from her mouth. I sat down beside her, and cried silently, holding that little flower like it was made of glass. I didn't correct her, I didn't explain, I simply nodded and whispered back, "I'm here," and I knew I always would be. As the weeks passed, the staff moved on, the house was sold, and I was given a new place to live, modest, peaceful, close to a school that specialized in children like Lena. I started over. No spotlight, no revenge parade, just a woman, a girl, and the freedom that comes from choosing dignity over destruction. In a world that loves noise, I had chosen silence, and silence had saved us both. Sometimes I look back, not out of regret, but to remind myself that power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it holds a child's hand. Sometimes it speaks not in threats, but in carefully chosen steps that lead to justice with grace. That's the kind of power I chose, and I never once raised my voice to claim it. So if you've been wronged, betrayed, or silenced, know this: you don't have to roar to be powerful. You don't have to break things to win. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay still long enough for the truth to speak louder than any revenge ever could. It's been a year now, a full rotation of seasons since I walked through the ashes of that house and into a new chapter with Lena. She's 7 now. She reads with her eyes and speaks with her hands, her laughter frequent, her spirit healing. The nightmares don't come as often, and when they do, she reaches for me in the dark, not with fear, but with trust. That to me is the greatest form of redemption. Not vengeance, not applause, just trust rebuilt where it had once been broken. I sometimes walk past mirrored shop windows and barely recognize myself, not because I've aged, but because I've grown. I used to think being strong meant carrying everything alone. Now I know it means knowing when to call for help, when to document, when to wait, and when to wait, and when to act. The world never clapped when I stood up for Lena. There were no viral posts, no breaking news, just quiet victories strung together, moment by moment, until the storm passed and left us standing in sunlight. Mr. Almasri never reached out. He left the country, from what I heard, moved his businesses elsewhere, but it doesn't matter. The system now knows his name, and more importantly, it knows hers. Lena isn't invisible anymore. Her story exists in sealed files, in protective orders, in case studies taught to young psychologists. She became more than a shadow in a surveillance feed. She became someone who was seen, truly seen. I still keep the journal I wrote in, the one I hid in my suitcase lining. Its pages are worn now, but I return to it sometimes, not out of bitterness, but gratitude. It reminds me of who I was when I was afraid, and who I chose to become in spite of that fear. A woman who didn't fight back with fists. A woman who used silence as strategy, and still managed to speak volumes. This story isn't just about justice, it's about the quiet power of those who are underestimated, the ones who are overlooked, dismissed, spoken over, but who watch, who remember, and who rise when no one expects it. I am not extraordinary, I am just prepared, and that made all the difference. So if you've ever been in a room where your voice was ignored, if you've ever been betrayed and left with only your instincts to guide you, let this be your reminder: you are not small, you are not powerless, and one day when the moment is right, your silence will be the loudest thing they ever hear. If this story stayed with you, comment "I see everything" one last time, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded. You don't have to shout to change everything. Sometimes you just have to wait and watch.